It was a cold and quiet night when Richard finally made the decision he had been putting off for months. The wind swayed the heavy curtains in the living room as he gazed out into the dark. The old house where he and Helen had raised their children felt small, suffocating. To Richard, that life was dying, and the 35-year marriage with Helen felt like a shadow of what it once was. The routine, the responsibilities, and the sheer monotony had extinguished the passion that had once united them. Or at least that's what he had convinced himself night after night. Helen was upstairs, as she was every evening, busy taking care of their grandchildren, who slept in a makeshift bedroom. That's how she spent her days and nights, taking care of others, always available, always exhausted. To Richard, she seemed like a woman who had lost her spark, who had sunk into a life of sacrifices. The vibrant, lively Helen of the past seemed to have disappeared, leaving behind only a shadow. "I can't take it anymore," he muttered to himself, his voice muffled by the silence of the house. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the framed family photos that lined the walls. Moments of happiness frozen in time. Those images made him uneasy, reminding him of a weight he no longer wanted to carry. He wasn't that man anymore, and Helen was no longer the woman he had fallen in love with. Then he thought of Louise. Her sparkling eyes, youthful skin, the energy he felt around her. Louise was the opposite of Helen. Vibrant, carefree, and she made him feel young again. Over the past few months, Richard had allowed himself to be drawn in by that enchantment, by the feeling that with Louise, he could escape the dullness of the old age creeping in. At 20 years old, Louise was the complete opposite of everything Helen represented. Ambitious, unconcerned with responsibilities, and always living in the present. She made him forget about his problems, his worries about the future, his family obligations. Richard had thrown himself into the relationship with a mix of passion and a desire to feel alive. But there was something else, something he couldn't or didn't want to see. Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Louise. "I'm waiting for you. Have you decided what you're going to do?" She wasn't one to wait long. Louise liked action, quick decisions, and hated uncertainty. Richard glanced at the clock. It was late, but he knew he couldn't put it off any longer. He had made up his mind. Tonight would be the night he left Helen. Climbing the stairs in silence, Richard felt the weight of the choice he was about to make. Every step echoed in his mind, bringing flashes of memories. The wedding, their children running through the house, birthdays, Christmases. How distant it all seemed now. When he reached the bedroom, he saw Helen, sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a cup of tea in her hands, her tired eyes focused on a magazine she was pretending to read. Her body showed signs of exhaustion, but there was something more, a persistent melancholy that followed her. "Richard, are you okay?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Helen had noticed his emotional distance for months, but never imagined what was coming. She had felt distant from him, but always believed it was temporary, just a phase. After all, they had weathered so many other storms over the years. Richard took a deep breath, trying to find the words. He had rehearsed this moment many times, but now, standing before Helen, everything seemed harder. I need to talk to you," he began, his voice hesitant. Helen looked up, finally noticing the weight in her husband's words. "I can't do this anymore, Helen," Richard said, in a tone that sounded firm yet laced with guilt. Helen blinked, confused, but her body felt the impact even before her mind processed the words. A lump formed in her throat. "What do you mean?" The question came out almost reflexively, but deep down, she already knew what was coming. Helen's heart began to pound. She fought to deny what she was about to hear. "I'm leaving," Richard said, and the silence that followed was cutting. His words hung in the air like a final sentence. Helen froze, unable to react right away. She had expected many things in life, but she never imagined being abandoned after so many years. After everything they had built together. "You're leaving?" Helen repeated, as if the words needed to be spoken again for her to understand what was happening. "I met someone," Richard admitted, feeling a chill down his spine as he finally spoke the words he had feared so much. Helen's face twisted in a mixture of shock and pain, and for a moment, she was breathless. Someone? What do you mean, someone? The tears came before she could stop them. After everything we've been through, Richard, her voice trembled. You're gonna throw it all away? For who? A younger woman? Richard didn't respond right away. He knew that anything he said in that moment would sound like an empty excuse. But deep down, he also knew he was chasing something impossible, a version of himself that no longer existed. I'm sorry, he whispered, knowing the words wouldn't have the power to heal the wound he had just opened. Before continuing with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel to support our work. That way, YouTube understands that our videos are good and shows them to more people. Can I count on your help? Thank you so much in advance. Helen remained seated, frozen, even after Richard left the room. Her mind refused to process what had just happened. Everything around her seemed to slow down. His words echoed in her head like a cruel sentence she didn't want to, or maybe couldn't believe. I met someone. 3 simple words, but they had destroyed her entire life. How could someone she had known for over 35 years, with whom she had shared everything, look her in the eye and say something like that? An overwhelming sense of emptiness filled her. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet, leaving her floating in a dark, lonely void. Richard was gone, and it wasn't just physically. He had left long before that night. What remained was a man she barely recognized. The same man who used to love her intensely, who would hold her hand during storms and whisper that everything would be okay. She looked down at her hands, trembling, as if they belonged to someone else. The silence of the house, once her refuge, now felt suffocating. Her mind began to sift through the past years, trying to pinpoint the moment when everything started to fall apart. Where had she gone wrong? Helen had given everything to her family, sacrificing her own identity to ensure that her children grew up with all the love and care she herself had never had as a child. She had always put everyone else's needs before her own. And now she was alone, abandoned, unsure of where to start again. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of the front door closing. Richard was gone. He had made his choice. His presence still lingered in the house, like a bitter shadow, but she knew he wouldn't return that night. Maybe he would never come back. Helen looked around, seeing her grandchildren's toys scattered on the floor, the family photos lining the shelves, reminders of a life that no longer seemed to belong to her. Her stifled sobs turned into deep, painful gasps. Tears rolled down her face, soaking the fabric of her pajamas. She didn't know how much time had passed since he had delivered the devastating news. Minutes felt like hours, and the clock kept ticking, indifferent to her pain. She wanted to scream, wanted to tear the photos from the wall, wanted to rip that weight from her chest. But instead, her reaction was different. She simply lay down on the bed, still fully dressed, and let herself sink into the sadness. Physical and emotional exhaustion overtook her, and she surrendered to the silence of that cold night, wishing the darkness would take away her pain. But the thoughts kept coming, relentless. She remembered the last time they were happy together, or at least what seemed like happiness. Some time ago, Richard used to sit beside her on the couch, his hand gently resting on hers as they watched TV. But the last few nights had been different. He would leave earlier, with excuses about work or business meetings, while she stayed behind to handle the household responsibilities. Lost in the routine of caring for their children and grandchildren, Helen had barely noticed when Richard started pulling away. The truth was, she had lost Richard long before that night, but hadn't realized it. He had changed, and she had buried herself in the daily obligations, believing that their love would survive everything. How could she have been so blind? Staring up at the ceiling, Helen felt unrecognizable. The woman she had once been, the woman Richard had fallen in love with decades ago, was as distant as he was now. She had lost herself in the commitments to her family, in the daily sacrifices. Slowly, she had given up on herself. When was the last time she had looked in the mirror and felt beautiful? When was the last time she had done something for herself? Something that made her happy? Helen squeezed her eyes shut, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts. But images of Richard with another woman flooded her mind. Who was she? The young woman who had stolen her husband, who had made him abandon everything they had built together. The anger started to grow inside her, a rage she never thought she was capable of feeling. It wasn't just the pain of abandonment. It was the contempt for everything Richard was doing to her after all these years. But at the same time, something worse gnawed at her. Guilt. Was it her fault? Had she failed by not seeing the signs, by not fighting harder for a love that was now slipping away? She didn't know if she could endure this. The weight of the betrayal felt crushing. The sadness mixed with anger, forming a knot in her stomach that wouldn't let her breathe. How could she go on? How would she face tomorrow? Outside, the wind blew fiercely, shaking the trees and whispering through the cracks in the windows. Helen felt a chill run through her body, but she didn't move. She didn't have the strength to leave the bed. All she wanted was for time to stop, for the world to stop spinning, and for this overwhelming pain to disappear. But life would continue, indifferent to her agony. And deep down, Helen knew she would have to get up. She would have to face reality. The question was how. While Helen sank deeper into her own sorrow, across the city, Richard was about to experience what he believed was the beginning of a new phase in his life. The apartment he had rented for Louise was luxurious and modern, far from the family home he had left behind. The city lights shimmered through the window, reflecting the sense of freedom he now thought he had gained. When he opened the door, Louise greeted him, flawless as always. Her blonde hair shone under the soft light of the room, and she wore a tight dress that highlighted her youth and sensuality. For a moment, Richard's heart raced. This was why he had made this choice, he thought. Being with Louise made him feel younger, more vibrant. It was as if, by her side, he could escape the harsh reality of his age and the routine that had worn him down over the years. "You took your time," Louise said with a mischievous smile as she crossed the room towards him. "I was starting to think you'd changed your mind." Her voice was soft, but carried a hint of impatience that Richard ignored. After all, Louise was different from Helen in every way. She was intense, unpredictable, and lived in the moment without worrying too much about the future. He was dazzled, unable to see what lay behind that facade of beauty and youth. "I was just wrapping up some last things at home," he replied, trying to hide the discomfort he still felt after leaving Helen like that. But just as he had in recent months, he forced himself to believe that he had made the right choice. He deserved to live this new life. The first few days with Louise were exactly as Richard had imagined. Dinners at fancy restaurants, carefree laughter, and a renewed passion he hadn't felt in years. Louise knew how to captivate him, how to wrap him in a web of fleeting pleasures that distracted him from the emptiness he didn't want to acknowledge. She was everything he thought he was looking for, or so he believed. However, as the days turned into weeks, Richard began to notice a change. Louise's initial enthusiasm was fading. The affectionate, frequent messages became rare, and her demands multiplied. "Can we go shopping tomorrow?" she would often ask. "I need a new dress for that event next week." Or sometimes it was a request for another cosmetic procedure, something that made her feel prettier in Richard's eyes. For a while, he catered to all her whims. After all, he wanted to keep Louise happy, to maintain the illusion that this was the life he wanted. But as the expenses piled up and Louise's company became less engaging, Richard began to feel a growing discomfort. The sparkle he thought he had found was starting to fade, like a light flickering one last time before going out completely. One night, after a dinner Richard had planned to surprise Louise, he noticed something different about her. She was distracted, barely touched her food, and didn't show the usual excitement. When he tried to talk about the travel plans they had discussed weeks ago, Louise was blunt. "Richard, can we talk about something more serious?" she began, crossing her arms and looking directly at him. Richard felt a pang in his chest. Serious? What did she mean by that? "Sure," he replied, trying to stay calm. "What's going on?" Louise sighed. her voice less sweet than usual. I don't know if this is working out the way I expected. You know, you have your commitments, your already set life. And me, well, I feel like I want something more dynamic, more fun." Richard's stomach turned. It was as if time had stopped for a second, and he was on the verge of understanding something terrible, but couldn't fully accept it yet. "More dynamic," he repeated, almost in disbelief. "I thought we were fine." "That's not it," Louise continued, with a hint of impatience. "It's just that sometimes it feels like we're not on the same page. I want to live, to explore, and I feel like you're too busy with other things. I'm not sure I want to continue like this." Her words hit Richard like a bomb. Louise was bored, and suddenly, he saw clearly what was happening. What he had built with her wasn't a real relationship, but an exchange of interests. Louise wanted the excitement, the novelty, the gifts. Now that he could no longer keep up with the constant pampering, she was starting to look for something new, something more exciting, something he, at 60 years old, simply couldn't offer anymore. He didn't respond right away. The silence between them became heavy, oppressive, and then Richard realized that perhaps Louise had never seen him the way he saw himself with her. He was just a means, a path to the life she wanted. The youth he had so desperately sought now revealed its true cost: loneliness. Meanwhile, Helen was going through a quiet transformation. The initial grief, the devastating shock of abandonment, was giving way to something deeper. She was still broken, but something inside her was beginning to stir. An unexpected visit from an old friend, memories of who she had been before losing herself and the responsibilities of family life, brought back forgotten memories. Helen was still there, somewhere, and maybe it was time to rediscover her. The shine that once surrounded Louise began to fade faster than Richard could have ever imagined. What had initially seemed like a dream, a way to escape the dull, predictable life with Helen, was now turning into a burden harder to bear each day. Louise was demanding more, much more. "Can you transfer the money now?" Her voice sounded impatient, almost cold, as she scrolled through her phone, not even looking at Richard, who was sitting next to her. It was a recurring request. Her new credit card was maxed out, the luxury gifts were no longer enough, and exotic trips seemed to be the only way to hold her interest for a little longer. Richard shifted uncomfortably on the couch, feeling a pressure that hadn't existed before. He knew something had changed. Louise was no longer the sweet, captivating woman from the first few months. There was a growing distance between them, like a silent shadow, stretching out, unstoppable. He could no longer ignore the reality. "Can't we wait until the end of the month?" He tried to stall, hiding his discomfort. His bank account was no longer as full as it once had been, and he felt the weight of each transfer, each new request. He didn't like to admit it, but the lifestyle Louise demanded was starting to weigh more than he could bear. "Richard," she replied, finally lifting her eyes from her phone, giving him a cold look that hit him like a punch. "I don't want to keep repeating myself. I've already told you what I need. If you can't give me what you promised, then maybe it's better if, I don't know, we take a break." Her words echoed in Richard's head. The veiled threat left him speechless. He never imagined the situation would escalate this quickly. A wave of regret began to form in his chest. Had he really sacrificed everything, his marriage, his family life, for this? For a relationship that now felt more like a transaction than one based on love? While Louise got up and walked towards the kitchen, Richard felt the weight of silence fill the space between them. The coldness that hadn't existed before now felt suffocating. He stood up, his eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the city lights gleamed as always, indifferent to the emotional chaos unfolding inside him. Richard felt a pang of nostalgia, a longing for something he didn't know he could lose. His home with Helen, his children, the routine he had so despised. Suddenly, it all seemed more valuable than he had ever admitted. The modern apartment where he now lived with Louise was not a home, and Louise, with her constant whims, was not the refuge he had imagined. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Helen was still recovering from the emotional storm Richard had left behind. But Surprisingly, that same pain was starting to forge her in ways no one could have predicted. She was no longer the woman who spent nights crying, hoping her husband would change his mind. The tears had dried, and the grief was giving way to something new and strange, a sense of determination. "You need to think about yourself," Helen, Sophie, a longtime friend, had said during a surprise visit to her home. "Look at everything you've done all these years. For your kids, for your grandchildren, for Richard, and where has it left you?" Sophie had always been a vibrant presence in Helen's life, but over the past few years, distance had grown between them, the result of Helen's tireless dedication to her family. Those words echoed in Helen's mind for days. And where has it left me? It was a painful question, but an honest one. From the moment Richard walked out the door, something had started to change inside her. Helen knew she couldn't keep living the same way. She felt that, for the first time in decades, she had to look after herself. For the first time, she had to live for herself. At first, the changes were small. She decided to return to the beauty salon for the first time in years, a decision that, by itself, seemed trivial but filled her with a slight sense of control over her own life. When she looked in the mirror after a modern haircut, she noticed something she hadn't seen in a long time. She was still there. Beneath the tired and neglected woman was a strength, a beauty, and an identity that had been buried under routine and self-sacrifice. Days later, as she passed by a Pilates studio near her house, Helen decided to step inside. It wasn't a planned choice, but an impulse, a voice inside telling her it was time to do something different. At the end of her first class, she felt exhausted but alive. Her muscles were tense, her breathing quickened, but above all, she felt like she was regaining a part of herself that had been lost. Helen was changing, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. And that transformation, slow but steady, began to reflect in the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, the way she saw herself in the mirror. She still felt the pain of the betrayal, still had moments when tears came without warning. But there was a spark now, a spark that grew brighter each day. Richard, on the other hand, was starting to feel the weight of his choices. The relationship with Louise no longer gave him the excitement he had sought. Now it was just a game of interests, and he was tired of playing. Deep down, he knew he had traded something valuable for a fleeting illusion. He had exchanged love for a whim, and for the first time, he was beginning to understand the colossal mistake he had made. The sound of the alarm echoed through the quiet house, but Helen had been awake long before it went off. Today would be different, she thought, as she got up with a lightness she hadn't felt in months. The sun was just beginning to rise, and the bedroom, once suffocating, now felt smaller, as if it could no longer contain her. Something inside Helen had changed for good, even if she was still in the process of discovering who this new version of herself was. The days of uninterrupted pain no longer paralyzed her. The sadness Richard had left in his wake hadn't completely disappeared, but it had transformed into something more subtle, more silent. The pain was now fuel, an energy that pushed her to get out of bed every morning and take care of herself in ways she hadn't done in years. Helen passed through the kitchen, where traces of her married life were still present. The coffee mugs Richard liked, the old photos and frames scattered across the counter. But she didn't linger on those details. She no longer let the past hold her, at least not like before. She put the kettle on and, as the steam rose, smiled at the mirror in the living room. Her hair was shorter now, elegant, and the dark circles that once marked her sleepless nights were starting to fade. She was coming back to life. Sophie, her longtime friend, had become a pillar in recent months. With Sophie's encouragement, Helen decided to explore more than just Pilates. She signed up for dance classes, rediscovered the pleasure of dressing up, of going out for coffee alone. The world outside her home, which had once seemed so distant and unattainable, was beginning to regain its color. It was as if, little by little, she was remembering who she was before being a mother, a grandmother, and a wife. But on that particular morning, Helen felt something different. It wasn't just the growing sense of freedom, but also a lightness that carried a new kind of empowerment. She had booked a trip, the first since Richard had left, and to everyone's surprise, she was excited. Helen was ready to live again. For the first time in a long while, she felt that life was full of possibilities, and the fear of facing the world alone was beginning to fade. Across the city, Richard was staring at his own reflection, feeling the complete opposite. The man he saw in the mirror looked older, more tired. What had happened to the brightness of his new life? The answer lay in the details he refused to fully acknowledge. Louise no longer cared. Their relationship, which had begun with so much passion and energy, had now dwindled to a series of empty moments, filled only by expensive gifts and endless demands. That morning, Louise barely spoke to him. Her request for a new trip, this time to Europe, had been left on the table as a demand, without even a good morning. Richard felt the weight of every purchase, of every effort to keep her happy, but he was also starting to realize that none of it would ever make her truly content. The problem wasn't whether he could meet Louise's desires. The problem was that Louise no longer saw him as someone essential in her life. She was bored, and he was exhausted. Richard left to walk around the city, the morning chill biting at his skin as his mind wandered. He tried to recall when things had started to go wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Everything seemed to be falling apart, out of control. He had walked away from the life he had built with Helen to chase something that now, he realized, had never really existed. Louise was just an illusion, a distorted reflection of what he thought he wanted. When he returned to the apartment, the scene that greeted him was a shock, though, in some way, he had expected it. Louise was sitting on the couch, with suitcases next to the door. The look she gave him was direct, devoid of any affection. There was a coldness there that hit him with devastating force. "Richard," she began, without any preamble. "I'm leaving." He blinked, trying to process what was happening. "Leaving? What do you mean?" Louise sighed, as if dealing with a child who didn't understand the rules of the game. "Look, I don't think this is working. I told you I wanted more, that I wanted to live, but you can't give me what I need. And honestly, this isn't what I imagined." Richard felt his stomach turn. This was the raw, unfiltered reality. Everything he had feared over the past few months was happening. Louise was leaving, just as he had left Helen. It was a cruel cycle. And now, Richard was exactly where he had left his wife. Alone, lost, unsure of what to do. He opened his mouth to speak, to try to argue, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? He knew, deep down, that their relationship had never been about love. It had been a game of convenience, of interests, and now he was the only one left while Louise went off in search of something he could never give her. "I already have a new place to stay," Louise continued, indifferent. "And honestly, I think this is for the best. We both know this wasn't going to last." Richard felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to scream, to beg, but he knew it would be pointless. He was alone, just like Helen had been months ago. The irony was bitter. As Louise walked out the door, Richard felt a wave of regret so intense that his legs gave way. He collapsed onto the couch, the silence of the apartment now overwhelming. Everything he had abandoned, everything he had sacrificed for this illusion, now felt like a string of irreparable mistakes. And where was he now? Without Louise, without Helen, without family. The plane began to descend, and Helen looked out the window, watching the city lights spread out below her. It was a strange feeling, yet incredibly liberating. She was traveling alone for the first time in decades. When Sophie had convinced her to take this trip, Helen hesitated, overwhelmed by years of insecurities. But now, sitting on that plane taking her to a new destination, she couldn't help but feel a quiet pride. Looking at her reflection in the glass, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The past few months had transformed her life in ways she never imagined. The worn, fragile woman who had been abandoned by Richard seemed like a distant echo. Now, she saw herself as strong, with a renewed determination. The sadness still lingered, yes, but it was under control. There was a new energy within her, a desire to live life for herself, without waiting for anyone to complete her. Helen disembarked with a sense of lightness. The coastal town she had traveled to was small but full of charm, with peaceful beaches and cafes lining the shore. She was there to explore, to relax, and to discover what else the world had to offer beyond the walls of her home and caring for her family. For the first time in a long time, she was thinking only of herself, and that was a new feeling, one she was beginning to savor. The next morning, Helen walked through the town's narrow streets, feeling the sun warm her face. The sea breeze brought a freshness that invigorated her senses. As she explored the small shops and local cafes, she found herself smiling at strangers, something that once seemed impossible. She wasn't running away from her pain, but was instead dealing with it in a way she never thought she could. Helen was rebuilding herself. Sitting in a cafe, a cup of tea in her hands, Helen remembered how everything had started to change. That visit to the beauty salon, the Pilates classes, and the conversations with Sophie. They were small things, almost insignificant gestures, yet they had triggered an avalanche of transformation. Now, looking at her well-cared-for hands, she remembered how much she had neglected herself. Everything had been for her family, for Richard, but that was over. And this trip was another step in her journey to rediscover herself as a woman, as an independent person. Helen smiled, a quiet, peaceful smile, while feeling the sea breeze and the sun lighting up her face. She was alive. While Helen was blossoming, Richard was sinking deeper into his own loneliness. Since Louise had left him, the apartment where they had once lived, once vibrant and full of life, now felt like a tomb. Her absence suffocated him, not because of the love he felt. He was starting to realize that had never existed, but because of the void her departure left behind. He was completely alone. That morning, Richard awoke in a dark room, the sound of silence amplified by the empty walls. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so lost. He looked around and saw Louise's suitcases still piled in the corner of the room, a cruel reminder that, once again, he had been abandoned. But this time, he couldn't blame anyone but himself. He sat on the couch, his face marked by exhaustion and lack of sleep. The loneliness weighed on his shoulders like a stone, and the regret consumed him. Why had he left it all behind? That question haunted him constantly. Richard had been seduced by an idea, by an illusion of freedom and youth that, now, he saw clearly. It had all been a selfish fantasy. He thought of Helen, of the last time he had seen her, with her eyes full of tears, silently begging him to stay. Richard had ignored her pain, convinced he was making the right choice. Now, he knew he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Helen, his partner of decades, was the only person who truly understood him, who had stood by him in every difficult moment, and he had discarded her as if their years together had meant nothing. Feeling a wave of desperation, Richard picked up the phone. He knew he needed to talk to Helen. He needed to see her, to tell her how sorry he was. But was it too late? His hands shaking, he dialed her number. The phone rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. Richard felt a sharp pain in his chest. She hadn't answered. He tried again. Nothing. The reality was starting to sink in. Helen was moving on. Maybe she didn't need him anymore. Maybe she was finding happiness without him, an idea that terrified him and filled him with regret. Richard sat, staring at the silent phone, not knowing what to do. His mind wandered back to all the moments they had shared, the laughter, the plans, the dreams they had once had. He had thrown all of that away for something superficial, something that now seemed so meaningless. Louise hadn't been the future he had hoped for, and now he was trapped in a reality of his own making, a reality that left him utterly alone. He needed Helen, not because he was lonely, but because he finally understood her worth, the value of what they had built together. But what he didn't know was if there was still time to make things right. That same afternoon, as Helen admired the sunset on the beach, she received a message on her phone. It was from a familiar number. Richard. Her heart raced for a moment, but she took a deep breath and looked at the horizon. She wasn't the woman who would beg for his return anymore. Helen was now in control of her own life. Richard stood in the middle of the living room, looking down at the phone in his hand, as the sound of the voicemail echoed for the third time that week. Helen hadn't answered. His heart pounded in his chest, overwhelmed by a growing sense of despair. He needed to talk to her, to fix the mistakes that were now consuming him, but Helen was unreachable. Since Louise had left him, everything in Richard's life had become a huge void. He spent his days alone, staring at the walls of the apartment he had once shared with his lover, now lifeless, colorless. All that remained was the echo of wrong decisions and the regret that gnawed at every part of his soul. He had lost everything for an illusion, and now he was on the brink of losing what little dignity he had left. That afternoon, he decided he needed to go after Helen. She was his only chance at redemption, his only anchor amid the chaos he had created. He drove to the house where they had lived together for over 30 years, his hands sweating on the steering wheel. With each mile, his chest grew heavier. When he parked in front of the house, Richard felt a knot in his stomach. The garden was still well cared for, but the absence of life seemed to reflect the emotional distance he knew existed between them. He walked up to the door and knocked, once, twice. No one answered. He called out for Helen, but the silence that followed only deepened the void inside him. Worried, he walked to the neighbor's house and knocked on the door. Maria, the elderly neighbor who had always been close to Helen, opened with a kind smile, but her face turned serious when she saw the expression on Richard's face. "Oh, Richard, you're looking for Helen, aren't you?" Maria said, with a tone of mild surprise. "She's not here." Richard's heart raced. "Is she okay? Where is she?" Maria looked at him for a moment before answering. "She went on a trip, decided she needed some time for herself. I think it's the best thing she could have done." Her words were gentle, but carried a hard truth. Helen was moving on. Richard thanked her, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. Helen was traveling. He hadn't known she was doing that, hadn't known she had made such a decision on her own. She was rebuilding her life, without him. As he walked back to the car, Richard tried calling Helen again, his hands trembling. Once again, it went straight to voicemail. He left a brief message, trying to hide the urgency in his voice. "Helen, it's Richard. I need to talk to you. Please, call me when you can." But the days passed, and she didn't respond. With each new failed attempt, Richard's desperation grew. He called more often, sent messages that were never read. Helen was out of reach, and the idea that she might be living a better life without him tormented him. The irony was bitter. He had left Helen to chase something new, and now she was the one discovering new horizons, while he remained trapped in the past. Meanwhile, Helen was enjoying her trip. She walked along a peaceful beach, the sound of the waves calming her thoughts. Richard's messages were still there, unread on her phone, but she wasn't in a hurry to respond. For the first time in a long time, Helen was thinking about herself, about her own happiness. She knew Richard was desperately trying to talk to her. Her phone vibrated constantly, and she saw the missed calls, but she didn't pick up. She wasn't ready. After all the pain he had caused her, Helen knew she needed more time before making any decision. Could she forgive him? That was a question that hovered over her mind, but one she wasn't ready to answer. After weeks of tranquility and renewal, Helen finally returned home. The trip had transformed her more than she could have imagined. She felt stronger, more confident in herself, and now she was ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, as she unpacked and organized the house, Helen heard the doorbell ring. When she opened the door, there he was, Richard. The initial shock was inevitable. He stood before her, thinner, worn, his eyes full of regret. There was a vulnerability in him, as if all the arrogance he once had been swept away by the weight of his own mistakes. For a brief moment, the two stood in silence, looking at each other like strangers who hadn't seen each other in a long time. "What do you say after everything that had happened?" "Helen," Richard began, his voice trembling. I need to talk to you. I don't know if you'll listen to me, but I have to try." Helen remained silent for a moment. Her expression was calm, but inside, a storm of emotions was swirling. The man standing in front of her seemed so different from the one who had abandoned her months ago. Richard looked visibly tired, like someone carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But she knew this conversation was inevitable. "Come in, Richard," she said, with a calmness that surprised even herself. She left the door open and walked into the living room. Richard hesitated for a moment before following her. As they sat down on the couch, Helen crossed her legs and looked at him, waiting for him to begin. Richard seemed lost, his hands trembling, trying to find the right words, but they didn't come easily. "Helen, I don't even know where to start," he finally said, his voice hoarse, heavy with guilt. "I know there's no excuse for what I did. I left you. I hurt you in a way I never should have. And now I realize how terrible I was. I realize that I've lost you." And Helen listened intently, trying to gauge what she was feeling. For so long, she had waited for this confession. Now that it was happening, something inside her wasn't reacting the way it once would have. There was no longer the urgency to reclaim what they had, nor the need to hear that he was sorry. She had changed. Richard continued. "Louise was a mistake. I thought I was looking for something new, but what I really did was destroy the only thing that mattered in my life. You. I'm so sorry, Helen, for everything. I'm not here asking for immediate forgiveness, but I would like to have a chance to try to fix things. If you'll let me." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Richard sat there, waiting for Helen's response, his heart in his throat. But what would she say? She looked at him with a serenity that made him nervous. He couldn't decipher what she was thinking. Finally, Helen took a deep breath. "Richard, you really hurt me. What you did, the way everything happened, was devastating. I spent months rebuilding myself, trying to find out who I was before all of this. And now that I finally have, you show up." She looked at him, and her eyes, once so full of sadness, now shone with renewed strength. "I've changed, Richard. I'm not the woman you left anymore. And honestly, I don't know if I want or can go back to who we were before." Helen paused for a moment, feeling the weight of her own words. She was in control now. Richard looked at her, waiting for the verdict, his hands still trembling with anxiety. The silence hung between them again, the sound of the clock on the wall marking each passing second. And now, the decision is in Helen's hands. What do you think? Should she forgive Richard and give him a second chance? Or move on with her new life? Comment below on what you would do in her place, and if you'd like to see the continuation of this emotional story in part 2.